Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Bradley Wolfe, and I'm going over Chapter 3 in Communication in the Real World. This version is hosted by James Madison University, and the chapter is on language and meaning. So language and meaning are connected to each other, right? The way the words we use help describe how we see the world, describe our thoughts, and the things around us. So if we're speaking English, we're going to have, we're limited by that language. People who speak Spanish or Chinese or other language, that's what they use, right? We have different words, different language, and sometimes when we're translating from one language to another, the meaning doesn't exactly um, have this say the same thing. So sometimes it's good to, if you're a really good translator, you don't just translate word for word what the person's saying, but you can translate that meaning by finding new words and new ways of describing the same thing. So we have a lot of things we can talk about with language, and this chapter often goes over language, just generally speaking, things across any language, how we see communication being impacted by the language that we use. So first of all, it talks about how language is symbolic. So our language system is made up of symbols. So symbol is something that stands in for or represents something else. So symbols are words often, right? We can also have pictures to be symbols to represent something else for us to, come together. So that it can be verbally spoken, it can be written, a written word, or even it talks about nonverbal, waving your hand back and forth. So, right, that's a symbol for hello, right? I'm trying to greet you. And certainly there are different ways, and depending on your language and culture, there's different ways of saying hi to people. You can just say hi, you can, wave your hand, and it means different things. Those nonverbal symbols have different meanings depending on the culture. Then there's also codes within a language system. So codes are culturally agreed on an ever-changing system of symbols that help us organize, understand, and generate meaning. So it's talking about how they're culturally agreed upon and they're changing. So both the symbols are changing. We add new words all the time to describe things. So every year they have the dictionary say, hey, here's the word of the year, a new word that's being used, often in the English language. Those dictionaries that I'm familiar with in the United States, they'll say, hey, here's our new English language word. But see, any language is adding new words all the time to describe, like the internet was a huge thing that didn't exist, 50 years ago, nowhere near the level that it does now. So talking about, tweeting something or searching or Googling, all those things have new meaning based on how our world is changing. Um, so that's something to keep in mind. All languages continue to change and continue to evolve. I know there's some Native American languages in Minnesota, where I'm from and grew up, and there's the Ojibwe language and the Dakota language. And so the people who are preserving those languages and working hard, they're creating new words within those languages to have meaning for our modern society. So like the words like pizza, right? Pizza is not a food that is within those cultural, traditions and heritages, but that's something that's eaten very often in the United States. So, okay, we need a word for pizza now within the language, and that's how it evolves. Using what language already exists, what words already exist, how can we use those or to make something new and to change it over time? It also talks about the symbolic nature of communication. It creates some displacement. So we're talking about things that are removed in space and time from our speaker and situation. So if you're telling a story about the past, you can use those symbols to help create that create that distance, right, and close that distance so we can understand what you're talking about. It also talks about how different words derive. So certainly you can read through more of this about the language system and tons of examples in this textbook chapter. But for the sake of time, I'll just keep moving. Next here is the triangle of meaning. So the triangle of meaning has a symbol, which I talked about, the thought, and then the referent. So the symbol here, the example is a dog. You may have a thought about a dog, but the referent, for each person may view a dog differently. I have dogs. My dogs are small dogs. So it talks here about Jack Russell Terrier mix. I have a Jack Russell Terrier mix as a little dog. He's like zipping around. He loves digging and making nests. And so in my mind, I may think of a dog. I may have this small little Jack Russell Terrier mix. Whereas other people, they think of a dog and their relationship with dogs, maybe they had German Shepherds. And so they're thinking a much bigger dog, or mastiffs, even bigger dog. So dog, the same symbol can have different reference to different people. This is where miscommunication can occur as well. So it may be something a lot more complicated than dog. We're trying to have a conversation, and we may have different reference that pop into our mind. So we may have to clarify to get on the same page. Because again, dog's a pretty basic symbol. Talking about an animal, but when we do something like, wealth or justice, we much more vague terms, the reference that come to mind, how we see that situation or success looks different for a lot of different people. And our thoughts around those may be different as well. So we may have different thoughts that we're trying to communicate, but because of the different reference, even using the same symbols, it can create some miscommunication. And so that's part of the process of communication. And, we have to co-create the meaning together. So with words, another way that there can be miscommunication or trying to get on the same page is looking at the difference between the denotation and the connotation of words. So denotation refers to definitions that are generally accepted by the language group as a whole, such as the dictionary definition of the word. Connotation, though, refers to definitions that are emotion or experience based, that people have associations with a word. So it talks here about the example of the word change. Change can have a positive or negative connotation depending on your experience. So you may think, hey, change is really good. I want to continue change. Other people may say, hey, change is bad. I like things the way they are. So we may be talking about change, but it can create different emotions and feelings for people, even though the denotation, the definition change is the same. We have different connotations around it. So it talks here about languages learned as people grow up, especially, we learn language. The English language is a written language. We also have, oral language. Other languages don't have a written language or just have more oral traditions in those cultures. And they just, learn by communicating with each other. We pick up language over time. They say the best way to learn a second language is by being immersed in that language. Some people are very, lucky to learn multiple languages from a young age. In the United States, we often speak English as a primary language, but that's not in other countries and cultures around the world. They speak 2, 3 languages is normal for most people in those countries. So again, just being able to learn different languages can take a lot of work, but it's about that immersion in the culture. But you also can learn up. Like I have Duolingo on my phone. I've been learning Spanish for over a decade. Still don't feel comfortable having a conversation with a native Spanish speaker, even though I know a lot of the words, and I certainly know those denotations. I don't know the connotations. I don't know all the rules, and trying to remember everything and translate in my head, it takes a lot of work. But yes, we always are learning language, and even with our own, the native language that we speak, I speak English. It takes me a while, I continue to learn English, right? It's not just, now I know how to read and write, so now I know English. Well, every year there are new words, right? There are new words, new ways of communicating, new ways of talking. So we are continually learning language. It's not just a fixed point where now I know language, right? You have to continue learning, and things change over time. So it talks here about the rules of language. So grammar refers to the rules that govern how words are used to make phrases or sentences. So someone would likely know what you mean by the question, where's the remote control? But the control remote that's very confusing. But depending on the language that you speak, they have different rules of grammar. Also, I've spoken with some English teachers, and they're saying the rules of grammar are getting more relaxed, right? I'm a communication teacher. If I'm communicating an idea to you and you understand what I mean, that's communication, right? It doesn't matter if rules of grammar are perfectly followed. Especially with oral communication, often we do not speak with proper grammar. They've done some studies where they've had people transcribe what's being said and then correct the grammar. And it's like nobody talks with perfect grammar. So that example comes from teacher education, where they were working with students and like, oh, you got to speak properly, right? And often that is used in a way that, often minoritized people who have different grammar structures, historically marginalized people, are using different grammar structures, and they're being, oh, you're speaking properly. Well, they're speaking properly either. Nobody speaks properly. Nobody speaks with 100% proper grammar. That might actually sound very awkward. So maybe there are a few people. I'm thinking Sheldon from The Big Bang Theory may speak with proper grammar most of the time. But, again, most people speak differently. But in communication, as long as you're communicating and you have meaning conveyed, that's still communication. So you don't always follow those rules, but there are rules. That is an important thing, even with other languages, other subcultures. There are rules of grammar in order to follow, in order to create that, co-create that meaning. And if you're not following those rules, it may be difficult to understand what you're saying. So it talks here about language is expressive. So there's a lot of different verbal expressions that can, help us communicate our observations, thoughts, feelings, and needs. So observations, those are things that we saw. For the example, it says, I saw a white Mitsubishi Eclipse leaving my neighbor's house at 10:30 p.m., right? Just very specific, descriptive way of communicating. You can communicate thoughts or things that we have in our head. So it talks about maybe conclusions, what we think is true or false, what, thoughts based on sensory information, what we like or dislike, our values, a lot of different thoughts that we can express. We can express feelings. In the United States, women tend to be more emotionally expressive than men and have a bigger emotional vocabulary. And there's some research that says having a bigger emotional vocabulary allows you to deal with those emotions better. So it's good to try and, I identify as a male and I have a small emotional vocabulary. That's how often men are raised. So that's something I've certainly worked on, trying to increase my vocabulary and being able to express my feelings better. But certainly that's something we all can work on, that emotional intelligence. But in the United States, in the broader American culture, often women are more nurtured in that way to be able to express emotions and handle those emotional. But again, there's men who are very great with emotions. There are women who are very closed off. So certainly, just these are more stereotypes about people. Some people fit into those stereotypes. Some people don't. It also talks here about with electronic communication, when we're emailing or messaging with each other, we may lose some of that, especially that emotion. So we may not know the tone of voice that's being said. So if you're being sarcastic over a text message, the other person may not read it that way. They may just read it as insulting. They may, again, there's a lot of nuance there. So sometimes using emojis can add some of that nonverbal communication. Like our tone of voice is nonverbal communication. So sometimes I'll add an emoji with a winky face if I'm trying to make a joke. And there are other ways of doing that as well, through text, in order to kind of mediate that, or even voice record yourself so the person can hear what you're saying. But then facial expressions, you're missing those. So maybe you need to do a video recording, or just a video call with the person in order to communicate. But again, we express it in a lot of different ways, is what that section is saying. And then to get the feedback as well, when we're getting that feedback loop, hey, does this person understand what I'm saying? Is there miscommunication? With that asynchronous communication, such as text messages or emails, you don't always get that immediate response. And sometimes that can be anxiety provoking, especially if it's an emotional message and saying, oh, what the person think of it? Are they judging me? Are they positively responding to it? Did they even see it yet? Right? Our mind can race with those thoughts. So the last part here, expressing needs as well, especially younger people, being able to express their needs. Oh, I'm hungry. I want to get down. I know my nephew, that was one of the things he was expressing his needs. He was in a high chair and he wanted to get on the floor, and he was pointing at the floor. And I don't interact with, I don't see him a lot. He lives in another state. And I'm like, what are you pointing at on the floor? I just kept looking at the floor. Like, what is he trying to point at? He wanted to get down. So he was trying to express his need. I want to get down out of the high chair. But I didn't know he was saying that. I thought he was pointing at something on the floor, maybe pointing at one of the dogs that were running around. I didn't know. So again, that's part of the communication process. Once you learn about each other more, you're able to communicate better. So certainly we can express needs when we're older as well, such as, I think we're moving too quickly in our relationship. That expresses a need. Or I need to spend some time with my hometown friends this weekend. Would you mind if I went home by myself? Right, so we can express the needs that we have. Or I'm hungry. Where do you want to go to eat? That can be a need as well. So a lot of different ways for us to express ourselves through the language that we use. It also talks about how language is powerful. So there's lots of ways that language has meaning for us in our lives. So it says here, language expresses our identities. So we're able to show a little bit about ourselves through the clothes that we wear, through the things that we say, whether we have a positive association with something or negative association. It talks about having an Irish identity on St. Patrick's Day and participating in that celebration and communicating about it. It says some music singers and comedians have reclaimed the label redneck, saying, oh yeah, I'm a redneck, right? That's part of who they are. it talks here about the Black movement, with the racial justice in the 1960s and using Black as a positive identity marker, and the queer movement, queer is a positive identity marker for the LGBTQ plus community, when that used to be more of a slur. So again, reclaiming those terms sometimes can be powerful as well, and figure out how we can, express our identities in a way that resonates with us and other people, and you know, that's an important, powerful part of communication. Language also affects our credibility. So again, when we're looking at proper grammar, some of the things that were stated early, following those rules, those cultural norms, it affects our credibility. If we speak more formally, we're going to be seen as maybe more credible if we're following those proper rules of grammar, especially in written communication as well. Just making sure everything's spelled right, you're using punctuation well. It's very different. Say, hello, Dr. Bradley Wolfe, or hello, Dr. Wolfe, I have a question about the class, versus, hey, Brad, can you help me with this, right? That's different, right? It's going to communicate differently to me. Now I'm flexible with how students address me, but some instructors, oh no, you should call, right? I have a doctorate. I worked hard for my doctorate. I like being called doctor. I always tell students that if you need something out of me, call me Dr. Wolfe. If you're just talking to me, you can call me Bradley. But it's good to flatter people, right? And use the more formal and, recognize their success and achievements and everything else. But it affects our credibility, how we're interacting with people, and the level of formality. And sometimes being formal can affect our credibility in a negative way if the other people are not looking for that formality. I have a friend who's a drug and alcohol counselor, and she works with inner city people in Minneapolis, often people who've been involved with the criminal justice system who are getting referred out for addiction treatment. And she was being more formal and trying to say, oh, I want to look professional in this environment. And they weren't looking for that. Being, a professional white woman did not fit with what those clients were looking for in order to best help them. And so her boss was very informal, used a lot of profanity, talked about her own addiction. Again, another white woman in that situation, but she was able, the boss was able to relate to clients much better because she was using language in a way that which resonated with the clients. So it affects her credibility, being able to read that situation and see what's appropriate. Language is a means of control. So it talks about directives or utterances that try to get another person to do something. So, hey, can you go grab me that, over there? So again, control is a word that has negative connotations, but it can be positive, neutral, or negative. So just being able to help each other out. It says verbal communication can reward or punish. When I give directions in my class, hey, here's the assignment, it's a means of control, right? I'm controlling students, what they do, but I'm trying to help them out by giving them the information they need to be successful in my class. So certainly it's a mean of control. It's not necessarily negative though, but it's guiding people in a certain direction. And people may not always follow our directives. They may not follow what we're asking them to do. Language is also dynamic. So again, it's changing all of the time. New words are being created. It says we may create a one-of-a-kind sentence by combining words in a new way and never even know it, right? So neologisms are newly coined or used words. There were words that were just brought into the existence, or using a word in a new way. So it talks here about English has been called the vacuum cleaner of languages. Sometimes the words are taken from other places, like karaoke from Japanese or caravan from Arabic. So it's borrowing a lot of words from other languages. Weekend is a popular English word based on a number of languages that have borrowed it as well. Based on the number of languages that have borrowed it. So again, language is not just, oh, this is English, this is Spanish, this is French, this is Chinese, this is Ojibwe, right? These languages interact with each other and have influence over each other. So it said before Facebook, the word friend may have, many meanings, but it's mostly a noun referring to companion. But now it says I'll friend you or I'll send you a friend request, right? It has a new way. Or Google, again, I gave that word before. If you go, 50 years ago and you said, oh yeah, go Google this. They're like, what are you talking about, right? Google didn't exist back then, so it wasn't a commonly used word. It also talks about here how the word gay used to be an adjective for feeling happy. It still is used that way, but more so in 40s, 50s in the United States, that's often what it was used. but then it expanded to be an adjective to describe a person's sexual orientation. Um, so again, changing the way that it's commonly used, and maybe those other ways of using it are no longer in existence. So slang is another example of the dynamic nature of language. So slang refers to new or adapted words that are to a specific group, context, or period of time, often less formal, and some creative play with languages. I've also seen a lot of, I don't know if this necessarily counts as slang, but bilingual people using both languages and mixing words. So Spanglish, Spanish, and English, where they were use both words and mix words together from both of the languages to create something new. And if you speak English and Spanish, you may be able to understand what they're saying, but it's also, definitely a code, a way of communicating with other people who have that linguistic heritage, right? It creates connection and community between those people. And that's what slang often does. It creates connection between people by having these common phrases, words that have meaning to your group, but it's not necessarily, it's specific to that group, that context, or that time period, and it creates connection. Language is also relational, right? It can bring us together by using supportive messages. So saying nice things about us, or even using we languages. We're going to do this. This is our project. So saying the things that bring us together, can be more thoughtful to bringing people together. More divisive language, and so, for example, it says instead of saying "you're making me crazy," right? That's you language separating us. You could say, I'm starting to feel really anxious because we can't make a decision about this. So it's talking about I am owning my own feelings, and then using that we language is that, hey, we're working together to make a decision. So you need to make a decision, right? We need to make a decision. That has different meaning for people and can bring us together. Language can also separate us, though, with using unsupportive messages. You haven't done any work today, you're so lazy, right? That's an unsupportive message. Sometimes get frustrated if we have a coworker or someone else who we're relying on to get something done and they don't do it. It can be very frustrating. But maybe we need to look at the barriers that they're facing and why it's not being done. Or maybe it wasn't communicated clearly to them in the first place. We were expecting them to get it done, or expecting them to get it done in the time frame, right? Oh, can you do the dishes? Okay, yeah, I'll do the dishes. And then an hour later, hey, the dishes aren't done. Well, I was going to do them. You didn't say they needed to be done right now. You just asked me if I'll do them, and I will do them, right? I'm not going to do them right now because I want to do other things. Again, looking at how we phrase things, how we phrase requests can impact the communication that takes place. So messages can be more supportive, or they can be more unsupportive depending on the language that we use. Talk about this a lot more in my interpersonal communication class, but here's just an intro. We're just kind of going over everything. So there are some common types of unsupportive messages. First is global labels. So you're a liar, right? You're labeling someone as irresponsible, untrustworthy, selfish, or lazy. It's talking about the person's whole identity into question. So it may be helpful saying you're lying in this situation instead of you're a liar. Or there's that negative self-talk. Some people use global labels on themselves. Oh, I'm such an idiot, right? Oh, or I wasn't smart in that situation, right? So it's good to avoid global labels either with other people or even with ourselves. Sarcasm, I like humor. So even though sarcasm is often disguised as humor, it's usually passive aggressive behavior which the person indirectly communicates negative feelings. I mean, I'm okay with some sarcasm, but yeah, you should be using sarcasm. If you have a problem with something, you should just be more direct and saying I have a problem with it. But I think some sarcasm is appropriate. Again, depends. You have to read the situation, read the other person, but it can be seen as a non-supportive message. Talks another unsupportive message, dragging up the past. Oh, I should have known not to trust you when you never paid me back the $100 that I let you borrow. Right? It's bringing up the past negative experiences, deflecting from the current situation, not talking about what's right in front of you. Then there's negative comparison. So comparing, to other people, everyone's unique, right? We don't need to compare to each other in those situations that may feel unfair to make some of those comparisons. And again, this is not just for how we communicate with other people, it's how we communicate with ourselves. Are we, comparing ourselves to the right metrics? Are we setting ourselves up for unrealistic? Oh, my sibling always does this, they're so great, and I'm ugly and stupid and all these other things. Well, maybe that's not a fair comparison to make. And everyone has their own strengths, and we need to look at the strengths and assets that we have instead of comparing ourselves in the way we may feel. Right? There's always going to be someone out there who's better than us at whatever it may be. Right? We can always find people who are better, but sometimes we just need to appreciate ourselves for who we are, Tim. Then the judgmental you messages, you're never going to be able to hold a job down, or it's very accusatory and overgeneralized statement. And then threats as well as a negative, unsupportive message. Right? Don't friend people. Or if you don't stop texting back and forth with your ex, both of you are going to regret it. Right? Just very vague threat there. But don't friend someone with violence or other negative consequences, because it's not as productive of communication that way. Right? There's better ways of addressing the situation. So 3.2 here goes to using words well. So being very clear with the words that we're using. So level of abstraction. I have a friend who often refers to grandma, right? Grandma can mean so many different things to him. It's very, I'm like, which grandma are you talking about? Are you talking about your grandma, your maternal grandmother, your great grandmother? Sometimes he refers to his mom as grandma because of the, kids or whatever. But again, like, who are you talking about? I'm going to go visit grandma. Who are you talking about, right? That can get frustrating for me. I'm more specific. The way I was raised, I have Grandma Ruby, Grandma Alice, right? You name the grandmas their title, and then you share their name as well. So that's how I was raised, and people are raised in different ways to use language differently. Even though we both speak English, we use English in different ways. So the level of abstraction is talking about more abstract and more specific. So the example here is wealth at the most abstract is a symbol that refers to prosperity, fortune, success. It could be assets of a very specific type, about a monetary worth of a possession. Livestock, right? Wealth and livestock, very different words. But livestock can be part of your wealth. Your wealth can be in the livestock. A cow, very specific type of livestock. And Bessie, who is, right? Bessie is the specific cow you're talking about. If you refer to Bessie as well, right? Bessie can be part of your wealth, certainly, but it's going to have a lot of different meaning depending on the word that you used. So sometimes, and then it says the most concrete is direct experience with sensory information about the thing that we will later call Bessie. So again, it's being more specific and using the right level of abstraction. Sometimes you want to speak broadly because you're referring to a lot of different things. You want to have everyone else relate to their own experience, which goes within that category. So if I say, hey, your pets are a very important part of people's lives and they can help with mental health, everybody then has the opportunity to think of their own pet and their own experience in the life. So sometimes that broader word is more than saying, hey, Chester, right? My dog's name's Chester. Oh, Chester brings that, some joy to life, right? Not everyone else can relate to Chester. None of you know who Chester is. You probably don't have experience with him. So that's not going to mean as much to you as if I said a pet, which is broader. So it's not just dogs, it can be cats, it can be birds, right? A much more broad term. So you have to figure out the right word and level of abstraction for the situation. And sometimes you'll need to clarify with each other to get on the same page. You may have different meanings in your head. Again, we think of the triangle of meaning again, the levels of abstraction. Both of those fit here in terms of getting on the same page with another person. So you're talking about the same thing. So it also talks about definitions and clarity. So if someone asks you to define the word blue, you'd likely say it's a color. You may have to give more specific information. You can be very clear. It's the color of Frank Sinatra's eyes, or it's what the sky looks like on a clear day. So again, putting more descriptive information or tying it to your personal experience can help you get on the same page with somebody else. So if you're saying, hey, I painted my room blue, well, what shade of blue, right? Being able to get more specific and finding something that they can relate to. And it also has here, I don't know why this definition is right here, but jargon refers to specialized words used by a certain group or profession. So jargon is very specialized to a workplace often. The people within that group know what it is, but people outside the group may not. So for example, I worked for the Minnesota Council of Nonprofits, and we always abbreviate it as MCN. If I say MCN to a random person, they're not going to know what I'm talking about. But if I said it to people within that group or within that context, or maybe even the nonprofit community in Minnesota, they may know what MCN means. So that's an example of jargon. So then here, using words effectively. So effective language refers to the language used to express a person's feelings and create similar feelings in another person. So effective language can be intentional, used to enhance interpersonal bonds. It can be used in public speaking to engage an audience or motivate them in a specific way. Some of that pathos, that emotional appeal. can be used through effective language. And effective language and affective language are different, right? Effective language, I'm just trying to be effective and getting my point across. Affective is about that emotion, right? That emotional element. So that A is very important. I'm looking at it, though I know those words sound similar. So it talks here about figurative language. So sometimes people say something's a figure of speech or a phrase in order to create meaning. For example, a simile is a direct comparison of two words using like or as. So life is like a box of chocolates. Um, you never know where you're going to get. Or I slept like a baby. That bread was as hard as a rock. So having comparisons. Whereas a metaphor is an implicit comparison of two things that are not alike or not typically associated, for you to connect to each other. So you must have some level of linguistic knowledge to be able to create metaphors and use your imagination in order to make sense of the metaphors too, to figure out what the person's trying to say. So again, if you're translating, this can be a lot difficult if too many metaphors are used, or English isn't your first language. You may not understand a metaphor being shared. So many metaphors are from everyday experience, such as we're saying a clock has a hands and a face. This type of metaphor is personification. So it refers to attribution of human qualities or characteristics to other living, of attribution of human qualities or characteristics to non-human objects or abstract concepts. So it creates more realness out of it if it's hard for people to understand. So it's been very effective in public awareness campaigns because it allows people to identify with something they may not think is relevant to them. So again, metaphors, you're not using the like or as simile, you are using it. But again, you're creating some sort of connection or comparison between words in order to express your meaning. Then there's evocative language. So vivid language captures people's attentions. So words like shiver or heartbroken, it can create a lot of meaning. So especially if you're like fiction writing or movies or whatever it may be, they can use a lot of evocative language to bring something to life for us as readers or viewers of it. It says some words are so evocative that their usage violates social norms of appropriate conversation. So when you're trying to figure out what's the right word for this situation, again, you may have to look at the cultural context of that setting. People often also will use euphemisms or less evocative synonyms for the references they're talking about. So often people use euphemisms for things like excretory acts, right? That's kind of a euphemism. It's very, very textbook word. It is a textbook, so that's what we have. We're talking about sex or death. We may use euphemisms to be more socially appropriate in those settings. Certainly in the workplace, you don't always want to talk about those things as much, but again, depends on the setting, depends on your relationship with people. What's appropriate way to talk about something, what's a not appropriate way to talk about something, or what shouldn't be talked about at all. So next it talks about using words ethically. The National Communication Association's Credo for Ethical Communication says that we should be accountable for the long and short-term effects of our communication. So in terms of ethics, we need to have civility. Civility we see in our political setting, it is not a lot of civility right now in politics. And so being able to talk and work with each other, in politics or even in a workplace, a lot of workplace drama or gossip, how can we work together in a better way to be civil with one another, engage in conversations and engage across differences? What do I need to take responsibility for to do differently? And what do the other people I'm engaging with need to be do to be more appropriate in that situation? So there's a lot of different ways to be civil. There's a lot of reasons why people may breach civility and may be, difficult or causing conflict. So there could be some individual differences which create conflict. I think one of the other chapters talks about conflict in a lot more depth. But sometimes just the way we're talking or the way we're raised may lead for some people to deem actions more uncivil on a regular basis. I grew up in a blue collar family, so I have some blue collar norms. And when I'm interacting, like how I eat, that's an example. I inhale food, right? That's how I was raised, just right? I like food. It's very enjoyable for me. But I know if I'm in a white collar setting or professional setting eating food, I need to adapt how I eat. I need to eat differently, so I need to take smaller bites, eat more slowly, to be a little more civil in that situation, right? It may be seen as uncivil, just eating nom nom nom, right? And so that's an example of some individual differences, not necessarily saying one's right or wrong, but it may be viewed as uncivil in a situation. There's also ignorance that some people, especially if they're in a new situation, they may not know what the social norms or expectations are, and they may say something offensive. If there's a group of people that they haven't interacted with on any regular basis, again, you may put your foot in your mouth or say something that's, unintentionally offensive. And that's just out of ignorance. That's not out of malice, intent, or spite. It's just, hey, you're ignorant. It's a new situation for them. So if you're new to a workplace, you may say something that's inappropriate for that workplace just by not knowing the social norms of the situation. So sometimes it's good to just take a moment to observe and see what's going on around you before saying anything. There's also lack of skill. So even when we know how to behave, we may not be able to do it. So it talks about engaging in personal attacks during conflict because they don't know what else to do. So just lack of skill. How do I appropriately engage in conflict? Right? Conflict doesn't have to be a bad thing. Conflict can be good to have different ideas, to have people come together to collaborate, brainstorm. But certainly, if you have a lack of skill on how to deal with a conflict, it may not go well. Lapse of control. Some people run out of self-control, especially children. They may not be able to control themselves, but even older people. I have a coworker who swears a lot, and so sometimes people just slip up and swear. There's in Congress right now, there's a senator too. He swears a lot, and he's like, "Oops, sorry." He's a farmer, and he just grew up on a farm, and he just uses whatever words come out of his mouth. And sometimes they have to say, "Hey, you need to watch your language here." Right, we're in Congress. We don't use that kind of language here. So just not having that self control. And some people say that, negative. You don't have self control. You need to use self control. But sometimes it's not an unlimited resource, as it says. Sometimes people are just so used to behaving another way that they slip up once in a while. Certainly, it's something that can be worked on, but it's not going to be 100% of the time. And then negative intent. Some people intentionally try to break conformity or challenge societal norms, or even just to benefit themselves, or openly uncivil and intentionally do so. But it can be a result of mental or psychological stresses or illnesses too. So sometimes there's negative intent and people are intentionally being rude and uncivil. So next it goes to polarizing language. So incivility can be related to polarizing language that people use. So swearing, it talks about social swearing. It can create bonds. Like I said, the one, my friend's boss, she swore a lot, was able to create bonds with the client she was working with. Certainly in friendship groups, people may swear, and it may seem cool or attractive in some way. Sometimes swearing is viewed as male dominated, but research shows that there has shown there's difference in the frequency and use of swearing by women are not as vast as perceived. So people do kind of swear in very similar ways, regardless of gender. There's also annoyance. Swearing provides a sense of relief and can use to manage stress or tension. I worked at Wendy's when I was in high school, and one of the things they told us when I was introduced on the job, they're like, okay, you can swear, but you're not going to swear at people, right? You're not going to call someone names, but if you just swear and drop it and say, whatever profanity comes out of your mouth because you do something wrong, that's fine. But don't swear at people, which is a generally good rule, right? Then there's accountability. So just one moment. So with the accountability, that's another section here. Okay, I just wanted to make sure it wasn't connected to anything else. Some of this stuff could be a little nicer in this textbook chapter. It's a free textbook, so we'll go along with it. Seems like a big, not a smooth transition here. But accountability, the complexity of our verbal language system allows us to present inferences as facts and mass judgments while seemingly being objective. So sometimes we're trying to say, hey, this is just a fact, when it's really an opinion. It may not be a fact. So inferences are conclusions based on thoughts or speculations, not direct observations. So we may infer something based on what someone else says, but we don't actually know it, or that's not exactly what they said. We were just inferring it. Facts are conclusions based on direct observations or group consensus, and judgments are expressions of approval or disapproval that are subjective and not verifiable. So often we'll say something, this is a fact, when it's really an inference, a judgment, or an interpretation even, when it's not really just a concrete fact. And sometimes people will use facts, selectively choose which facts they're looking at and sharing to misinterpret what's actually being said. So there's a frequent source of miscommunication about inference, observation, confusion, or the misperception of an inference, a conclusion based on limited information. And you're making a conclusion based on limited information when it's really just, and you're saying it's an observation or more of a fact when you're just inferring it, right? It's not actually something that happened. So, for example, this professor grades unfairly and plays favorite. They are presenting an inference and a judgment that could easily be interpreted as a fact. So trying to say, oh, this is a fact, this is how the professor grades, or they play favorites, when it's really just an inference that the person's making based on their experience with the instructor. So sometimes it can help clarify the message to be more accountable. So it says, for example, in this, I think this is the same example. I worked for 3 days straight on my final paper and only got a C, which can be a fact about the situation. You assume the person is true. But my friend told me she only worked on hers the day before it was due and got an A. So I think this is unfair, and I felt like my efforts weren't recognized by the professor. So being more specific, giving the person more details. So it's not just you're saying your inference as a fact, but you're giving the person the full details of the situation so they can maybe make the same inference out of the situation or judge for themselves. So sometimes that additional information is helpful. Then 3.3 here is on language, society, and culture. So again, there's a social context. So culture can speak broadly, the United States culture. It can be more specific, the culture at Ridgewater College. It can be, the culture of the LGBTQ community. So, all these different ways of looking at culture, right? Culture is a very broad term. So it talks here about a longtime member of this community, maybe where you live as a first generation college student. It may give your social location and how you're perceiving that situation, right? So being able to see things differently. So often in higher education, I identify as a first generation college student because my parents didn't go to college, but that's important to my identity and how I interpret things within this situation. That I like working with students. I understand some of those struggles of trying to get the norms of higher education. So I try and be very empathetic and supportive of my students because of that. Or someone who maybe has, their family has been going to college for a couple of generations, they may have a different experience or viewpoint on, what's necessary to be successful. I'm always glad to work with students. But again, that's based on my context that I have. So again, there's social norms with any of those contexts. The social norms in a workplace is going to be different than social norms in your family or friend group. And you know how to code switch between those situations. So code switching is being able to change the way you're talking or communicating with others depending on the situation. Most people are pretty good at code switching. Some people are just, hey, this is who I am. I'm going to be authentically myself regardless of the situation. And that's certainly a way to approach things as well. So language and cultural context. So languages vary by country and region, but also, we may speak the same language but not be able to understand each other. I have a relative who's from Alabama, married into the family. I cannot understand what he's saying. He's from rural Alabama. I am from Minnesota. I do not understand him. I can get like half the words that come out of his mouth just because of his accent. And so sometimes, even though we're speaking the same language, that doesn't mean you necessarily can communicate with each other. So that's part of it as well. So based on the accents we have or the way we use language can be very different from one another. I know a woman too. I don't remember where she was from, but one of the things that stood out to me, she's from another country, moved to the United States, and she speaks with an accent from that other country, right? So it's a non-American accent. But she says only English is spoken in her country, right? She doesn't know any language besides English. But she comes here and sometimes will be speaking with an accent, and she's had people yell at her like, "Oh, learn to speak English." She's like, "I only know how to speak English. I don't know any other language. I don't know what you expect of me." Right? Because they did view her accent, they viewed her accent as an outsider, a foreigner, when really that's all she spoke, right? That was not even a second language for her. That's the only language she spoke. She just spoke with a different accent than people were used to. And certainly, if you learn about intercultural communication, there's a lot more about individualism versus collectivism, how we relate to each other, how we get along. You can read a little bit about that here, but I think there's another chapter that will go into that into more depth as well. But talking about kind of the group membership and cohesion in some cultures versus in the United States is very high in individualism, but some subcultures in the United States view more of a collectivistic culture, so caring more about the community and family than the individual. Then there's customs and norms, so they're culturally relative. So what's polite in one culture can be very impolite or different in another culture. Once there was, um, I forget which president it was, visiting Australia and just doing a peace sign. I think it was doing a peace sign like this. So it's driving out the window, doing peace to everyone. And in Australia, this means like up yours, right? It's a very offensive and vulgar symbol. But in the United States, he was just saying peace, right? He was just, I don't remember which way he was doing it, but one of these ways, it was very vulgar to them. And like, why is the president of the United States just like flipping all of us out, like giving us the middle finger? That doesn't make sense, right? But it was very inappropriate based on that setting. But for the president, he was just trying to say peace to people. Gender also affects the language that we use to some extent. So again, there's some gender norms that's certainly changing now. A greater number of people are even identifying as non-binary. There we were. That word was coming to me. Non-binary. So like don't identify as a man or a woman, just non-binary. So again, having different norms even there and how we view gender can be different based on the culture. And the culture changes, right? Some cultures around the world, they've always had kind of a non-binary gender, both maleness or femaleness, throughout their history. Whereas in the United States, this non-binary perspective is something that's newer to how gender is being viewed, especially by younger generations. So then there's language and cultural biases. So a lot of different parts of our identity fits in with our culture. So our age is part of our culture, gender, ability, race, sexual orientation. We may have a cultural bias. Like I live in rural place, so I'm a rural person. That affects my bias as well. And those biases can be impacted in the language that we use. Often we're unaware of them and that we don't even know. And sometimes much of that biased language is based on stereotypes or myths that we have learned or inherited over time. For example, one word that I used this in a meeting. I'm like, oh, we don't want to gyp the people off, right? I didn't know the word gyp, right? To me, that's just ripping them off, right? I didn't know anything else. And someone pulled me aside after that meeting and let me know that gyp derives from gypsy, which is, the Roma people in Europe. And it's saying, oh, yeah, all these gypsies, they're swindlers and thieves. We don't want to be like them. And I'm like, I didn't even realize, and that makes sense now that gyp and gypsy are connected. I didn't even realize that connection there, and that I was talking about this group of people, this ethnic group of people, and using a slur against someone. I was just having an everyday conversation. So sometimes we don't even know that we're saying something that may be viewed as racist or offensive to other people. So it talks about race as well. There are a lot of stereotypes related to race that may be in our language. Talks about euphemism for race, like instead of talking about someone saying they're black, saying, oh yeah, they're urban. It's this urban culture, when really they're making statements on African Americans. I heard this once from a speaker. He was talking about Donald Trump from New York City. He's had buildings all over New York. If there's nothing more urban than Donald Trump, but you wouldn't call Donald Trump urban, right? Even though he clearly is a big city guy, and based on his history and his work, all over the world, doing buildings often in bigger cities, large buildings, very much kind of that, our urban lifestyle. But you wouldn't refer to him as urban, because urban has some connotations related to it, often related to race. So that's something to think about as well. It also talks about sometimes as we view race, how do we break people up into different racial groups when referring to them? Sometimes a growing number of people are multiracial. I think that's the largest growing racial group in the United States, because of interracial marriages as being more common. It used to not be common. Now it's much more common, interracial marriages and relationships. I have many of my cousins have interracial relationships or even adopted kids. So certainly there's a growing diversity in my family and in many families across the United States. That says talking here using the label person or people of color can indicate solidarity among groups, but also it can just put everyone together. And sometimes people want more specific, saying, hey, I'm not just a person of color, I'm black, or even more specific, I'm not Asian, I'm Korean, right? Being more specific about their identity. Often on the individual level, people prefer that more specific identity, even white people, right? I have a lot of British ancestry. I know we talked earlier about St. Patrick's Day and that Irish identity, or having a German identity. Sometimes those more specific identities are more relatable to people, and they prefer to be labeled that way when you know their background, or they may refer to themselves that way. Then there's gender. So there's a lot of stereotypes related to gender. Talking about Stereotypes related to people, how people should be. Oh, men should be masculine, they should be strong. Women should be, I'm trying to think of some stereotypes about women now. Women often wear a lot of makeup and are judged based on their body and their looks, what they have. So again, that language that we use impacts even like how we interact with little kids, like babies. Sometimes people very much want to know what is the gender of your baby, so I can know how to interact with them. All right. Oh, my nephew, my sister often says, "Oh, show me your muscles," and he does this, and so those are things that they taught him. They interact with him, because of his gender in a specific way. Whereas if you had a little girl, you probably wouldn't be saying, "Oh, show me your muscles," right? That'd be seen as weird, but you certainly could, right? If you want to push some of those gender norms or be more inclusive. But it's interesting. We often interact with people based on their gender. So it says one way to avoid gender bias would be using gender neutral pronouns like they or their instead of him or her. And some people prefer to be called by gender neutral pronouns. Oftentimes, when I'm interacting with students in an online environment, sometimes I'll write up reports to again, right? I'm using it to their academic advisor if we're having an issue. And in an online environment, I can't always tell what gender someone is by their name. So sometimes it's a lot safer for me just to say they're them, or they're having an issue with this, instead of trying to guess what gender they are. Just some names are very gender neutral. Some names I may just not be familiar with at all, and so I don't know what gender they are. So again, using their. So that's very common to use in our culture. To use when we don't know the gender identity of someone, just to use they or them. And some people are now preferring using they them as their pronouns, right? That's something they're owning as part of themselves, to not have those associations with him or her. See, I like you being called doctor, right? That's cool part of doctor's gender neutral title. So you just call me Dr. Wolfe, right? You don't need to refer to me as him or her, right? Sometimes, and some people are more sensitive about being misgendered. So if you call me he or him, that's fine. Identify as a male, they or them, that's fine. Her, or she, I would laugh. Like people have done that, just like misspoke and refer to me as she or her, and I just laugh, right? I'm not sensitive about that. I don't care. You want to call me she or her, that's fine. Other people may be a lot more sensitive about that, especially if someone is transgender or non-binary. They may be more sensitive about being misgendered, or some people may take offense to that. Oh, if they strongly identify as a male, like, why are you calling me a her? I'm not a woman, or I'm not a man, right? I'm a woman. So it depends on the person and how they are going to interpret that sort of communication. There's also gender neutral terms like instead of waitress, calling someone a server, instead of a chairman, just a chair or chairperson, instead of mankind, talking about people, instead of cameraman, camera operator. My mom's a lunch lady. I refer to her as a lunch lady. So some of those things are very ingrained in us, but a food service worker, that's very long. It can just be a lunch lady. Men can be lunch ladies too. That's what I think. Again, there's that bias in our language, though, and how we perceive things. And that's the point of this. So it's not necessarily saying we're going to get rid of all the bias in our language and all the bias in our mind, but just to recognize that we do have bias, and that bias impacts how we perceive things. So age as well is something that can have a bias either for or against younger or older people. So description of the younger people often presume recklessness or inexperience. This new generation, they don't know what they're doing, right? That's said like in every generation, just the age, the age of the people. It's not about, the entire generation's just like that. It's just the age that they're at right now. While older people often presume frailty or disconnection, so often has connotations of weakness, when old people can be very strong, can be very fit, and can do a lot of things. And so again, it's, recognizing that we have these stereotypes in our mind, these biases in our mind, and being able to set them aside and trying to eliminate them from our language as we can, or challenge them when we hear other people. So it says referring to people over the age of 18 as boys or girls is not typically viewed as appropriate. Or sometimes I think of my students as my kids. I'm not really that much older than any student. Some students I've had who are older than me, but again, sometimes, oh yeah, I want to help the kids. I want to help the kids do well in class. And it's like, okay, they're not kids, they're all adults. And so just challenging the way that we view things. I worked with younger kids too. First time I taught was fourth and fifth graders. I tutored them in math, working with kids. I'm a teacher, I work with kids, right? But I teach college, I work with adults. So sometimes I just need to challenge that. So sexual orientation as well. Sometimes there's negative stereotypes associated with homosexuality. They've also talked about stereotypes within the community as well between gay people, lesbians, gay men, lesbians, and bisexual people, have different labels, and sometimes they're viewed as a group. There's the LGBT community, and then LGBT without the T. I've heard that in some people who may be gay or lesbian, but not as accepting of transgender people. But definitely transgenderism is not necessarily sexual orientation, but often viewed as part of that community, LGBTQ plus, as one community of people together. Most people prefer labels such as gay or lesbian or bisexual, gay, lesbian, or bisexual to homosexual, because homosexual seen as very clinical and does not refer to so much identity as the sex act. Some people are fine being called homosexual or identify as that. So again, it depends on the person where they're in the community, but often calling, gays seen as a broad label for anyone, within that community. Queer is even broader label. So again, it depends on the person as well. And it also talks about affectional orientation instead of sexual orientation, because it's not just about sex, right? It's about those romantic relationships. Heterosexual relationships aren't just about sex. It's about the intimacy, closeness, and affection between people. Next here, we're almost done. Ability. So ability talks about people with disabilities. So some people refer to people without disabilities as able-bodied. Sometimes they say disabled is a word that they own as part of their community, part of their identity. Other people want the person first language, people with disabilities. So there's certainly a lot of variation within the community about what is preferred. Talking about handicapped or handicapable, right? Those are some words that I've heard, but again, it depends on the individual, what they prefer. And some people don't like to be identified strongly with their disability, right? Just part of who they are, but it's not who they are. So again, that's a lot of different ways to describe the same thing, and there may be different preferences based on the individual or person. And that's why it's good to know a lot of people with any of these identities. It's good to know a lot of people within that group to understand the diversity. I had one class in college, and we had a Black male speaker talking about the African American community. And I remember the conversation after, one of the students in my small group was like, "I didn't know all Black people thought like that." And I'm like, that was one Black person. He didn't represent all of Black people, right? I've interacted with other Black people, and not everyone within that community necessarily agrees or sees everything the same. And we shouldn't stereotype and saying, "Hey, I met one person in that community, so that makes up everybody in that community." Right? There's a lot of diversity within any community, within any culture, within any country. There's tons of diversity, and we need to recognize that. So this chapter talked about language and communication, how those come together, language and meaning. And again, within any language, there's a lot of diversity in different ways of using the same language, of using the English language in so many different ways to communicate. And there can be miscommunication within the language as well. So sometimes it's helpful to clarify the meaning and what we intended, or we can change our words up front to be more polite in our communication, to be civil, and figure out how to interact with people in an appropriate way. But sometimes that doesn't happen, and we have to manage that conflict. We have to manage to understand each other and work through those issues in order to just kind of get along with each other as a society. So understanding language and meaning can help your friendships, your family relationships, your workplace communication. It can help in a lot of ways and help you understand yourself better as well, and understanding, oh, I have some bias in my language that I didn't even know about. So hopefully you found this lecture helpful. I went over quite a bit of information here. Certainly you can read through more examples in this section yourself. But thank you for watching. I appreciate your time. And always feel free to reach out if there are any questions.